The silencing of the cannons of war left the victorious United States with a new set of problems, no less challenging than the war itself. How would the South rebuild its shattered society and economy after the damage inflicted by 4 years of war? What would be the place in that society of 4 million freed blacks, and to what extent, if at all, was the federal government responsible for helping them to adjust to freedom? Should the former states of the Confederacy be treated as states that had never really left the Union? Or should they be treated as conquered territory, subject to continued military occupation? Under what conditions would the Southern states be fully accepted as co-equal partners in the restored Union? Who had the authority to decide these questions of Reconstruction, the President or the Congress? The conflicts that existed before and during the Civil War between regional sections, political parties, and economic interests continued after the war. Republicans in the North wanted to continue the economic progress begun during the war. The Southern aristocracy still needed a cheap labor force to work its plantations. The freedmen and women hoped to achieve independence and equal rights. However, traditional beliefs limited the actions of the federal government. Constitutional concepts of limited government and states' rights discouraged national leaders from taking bold action. Little economic help was given to either whites or blacks in the South, because most Americans believed that free people in a free society had both an opportunity and a responsibility to provide for themselves. The physical rebuilding of the South was largely left up to the states and individuals, while the federal government concentrated on political issues. Throughout his presidency, Abraham Lincoln held firmly to the belief that the Southern states could not constitutionally leave the Union, and therefore never did leave. The Confederates, in his view, represented only a disloyal minority. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson attempted to carry out Lincoln's plans for the political reconstruction of the 11 former states of the Confederacy. So, during the war years, Lincoln hoped that the Southern states could be induced to rejoin the Union, though technically, in his view, they had never really left. He wanted them to meet a minimum test of political loyalty. As early as December of 1863, Lincoln set up an apparently simple process for political reconstruction. That is, for reconstructing the state governments in the South so that Unionists were in charge rather than secessionists. The President's proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction provided for full presidential pardons for most Southerners who took an oath of allegiance to the Union and the U.S. Constitution and accepted the emancipation of slaves. Also, you could get state governments could be reestablished and accepted as legitimate by the U.S. President as soon as at least 10% of the voters in the state took this loyalty oath. In practice, Lincoln's proclamation meant that each Southern state would be required to rewrite its state constitution to eliminate the existence of slavery. Though it seems like a lenient policy, Lincoln's policy was designed to shorten the war and to give added weight to his Emancipation Proclamation, because remember, this is 1863. At the time, this is late 1863 again, Lincoln feared that if the Democrats won the 1864 election, they would overturn his proclamation. Many Republicans in Congress objected to Lincoln's 10% plan. They argued that it would allow supposedly reconstructed state governments to fall under the domination of disloyal secessionists. In 1864, Congress passed the Wade-Davis bill, which proposed far more demanding and stringent terms for Reconstruction. The Wade-Davis bill required 50% of the voters of a state to take a loyalty oath, and it also permitted only non-Confederates to vote for a new state constitution. Lincoln refused to sign the bill. He pocket vetoed it after Congress adjourned. So, how serious was the conflict between President Lincoln and the Republican Congress over Reconstruction? Historians still debate this question. In any case, Congress was no doubt ready to reassert its powers in 1865. Congress has traditionally become more assertive after a war. In March of 1865, Congress created an important new agency called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. This was also known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau acted as a kind of early welfare agency. It provided food, shelter, and medical aid for those who were made destitute by the war. Both blacks, so chiefly freed slaves, and also homeless whites. At first, the Freedmen's Bureau had authority to resettle freed blacks on confiscated farmlands in the South. Its efforts at resettlement were later frustrated, however, because President Johnson pardoned Confederate owners of the confiscated lands. So courts then restored most of the lands to their original owners. The Freedmen's Bureau's greatest success was in education. Under the leadership of a man named General Howard, Oliver Howard, the Freedmen's Bureau established nearly 3,000 schools for freed blacks, including several black colleges. In his last public address on April 11, 1865, Lincoln encouraged Northerners to accept Louisiana as the first reconstructed state. Louisiana had already drawn up a new constitution that abolished slavery in the state. It also provided for African Americans' education. So Lincoln also addressed the question, which was highly controversial at the time, of whether freedmen should be granted the right to vote. He actually said, this quote here, "I myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." So it's 3 days later that Lincoln's evolving plans for Reconstruction will end because Lincoln is assassinated. His last speech suggested that if Lincoln had lived, he probably would have moved closer to the position taken by the radical Republicans in Congress. In any event, hope for lasting reform was really dealt a devastating blow by Lincoln's sudden assassination. So Andrew Johnson's origins were as humble as Lincoln's. Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, will succeed him after his assassination in 1865. Johnson was a self-taught tailor. He actually rose in Tennessee politics, so in the South. He championed the interests of poor whites because they were in economic conflict with rich slave-holding planters. Johnson was the only senator from a Confederate state who actually remained loyal to the Union. After Tennessee was occupied by Union troops, Johnson was appointed that state's war governor. Johnson was a Southern Democrat, but Republicans picked him to be Lincoln's running mate in 1864 in order to encourage pro-Union Democrats to vote for the Union Party, which was the Republican Party. In one of the accidents of history, Johnson became the wrong man for the job. He was a white supremacist, but as the new president, he was going to have to now clash with the Republicans in Congress, because those Republicans in Congress believed that the war was fought not just to preserve the Union, but also to liberate blacks from slavery. So at first, many Republicans in Congress welcomed Johnson's presidency. Because of his apparent hatred for the Southern aristocrats who had led the Confederacy. In May of 1865, Johnson issued his own Reconstruction Proclamation. His Reconstruction Proclamation is very similar to Lincoln's 10% plan. In addition to Lincoln's terms, he also provided for the disfranchisement of former leaders and office holders of the Confederacy. So that means that former leaders of the Confederacy would no longer be able to vote or hold office. He also called for the disfranchisement of Confederates who had more than $20,000 in taxable property, because those Confederates were most likely to be former slave holders. So Johnson retained the power to grant individual pardons to disloyal Southerners. So this is kind of an escape clause for the wealthy planters. Johnson made frequent use of his power to pardon. And as a result of the president's pardons, many former Confederate leaders ended up back in political office by the fall of 1865. So just 8 months after Johnson took office, all 11 of the ex-Confederate states qualified under the president's Reconstruction plan to become functioning parts of the Union. The Southern states drew up constitutions that repudiated secession, negated the debts of the Confederate government, and they also ratified the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. So on the other hand, none of the new constitutions extended voting rights to blacks. Also, to the dismay of the Republicans, former leaders of the Confederacy were elected to seats in Congress. For example, Alexander Stephens, the former Confederate vice president, was elected U.S. Senator from Georgia. The Republicans became further disillusioned with Johnson when the Southern state legislatures adopted black codes that restricted the rights and movements of the newly freed African Americans. The codes prohibited blacks from either renting land or borrowing money to buy land. The codes also placed freedmen into a form of semi-bondage because the black codes forced freed African Americans to serve as, quote, vagrants and apprentices, end quote, because they had to sign these work contracts. And that contract labor system in which blacks worked the cotton fields under white supervision for deferred wages seemed very little different from slavery. Also, blacks were not allowed to testify against whites in court. So a lot of the Republicans in Congress began to ask who won the war, because it seemed as though the Southern former Confederates were kind of having their cake and eating it too. So in early 1866, Congress's unhappiness with President Johnson developed into an open rift. Northern Republicans in Congress challenged the results of elections in the South, and they actually refused to seat Alexander Stephens and other elected representatives and senators from ex-Confederate states. Johnson alienated even moderate Republicans when in early 1866 he vetoed 2 important bills. One was a bill increasing the services and protection offered by the Freedmen's Bureau, and another was a civil rights bill that nullified the black codes and granted full citizenship and equal rights to blacks. Unable to work with Congress, Johnson took to the road in the fall of 1866 in his infamous swing around the circle to attack his congressional opponents. His speeches appealed to the racial prejudices of whites. Johnson argued that equal rights for blacks would result in an Africanized society. Republicans counterattacked by accusing Johnson of being a drunkard and a traitor. They appealed to anti-Southern prejudices by employing a campaign tactic known as waving the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt means inflaming the hatreds of Northern voters by reminding them of the hardships of war. Republican propaganda made much of the fact that Southerners were Democrats, and by a gross jump in logic, branded the entire Democratic Party as a party of rebellion and treason. Election results gave the Republicans an overwhelming victory. After 1866, Johnson's political enemies, both moderate and radical Republicans, would have commanding control of Congress with more than a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate.